All right, everybody, welcome back from our little break. I'm batting cleanup, as they say. It's the late part of the afternoon. We've had our lunch. We've had some great speakers, and so now I, want to kind of wrap us up for the day. I'm really happy to be here. I'm thankful for Brendan Sailing and for Charlie for inviting me. And let me just tell a little bit of a story. When Charlie first reached out to me and said, Derrick, would you come speak at this symposium we're trying to put together? And I said, oh, I love, sort of new ideas and so forth. But in my mind, I said, I'm on sabbatical. I've been on sabbatical all year. I've been sailing and kayaking and fishing. And, I haven't been in my academic space for a while. But one of the things that we do on sabbatical is think through next steps. And this may be my last sabbatical. And so I'm trying to think about what's next. What do I want to do? And so, as you'll see, and I'll talk about a little bit more, most of my work has been around persons with physical disabilities, deaf and hard of hearing, blind and visually impaired, and mobility impaired. And I didn't start to work in the learning, developmental disabilities and intellectual and developmental disabilities until we started to collaborate with Special Olympics. And that really opened up another avenue of my work. And so today was first starting to work with Charlie and with Brendan, has started me moving in that direction. Even, we've had all of our conversations since I've been on sabbatical, and I've been thinking about that. And today has really just kind of exploded my thinking when I go back to campus in a month or so. So I just wanted to set that context. So just like you said, Danielle, I'm kind of using this as an opportunity to kind of think through what do I want to do next. So what I thought about with the presentation is I would give you a good sense of the range of things that I do, the frameworks that I use to organize my work, and I'll tell you about some of the projects that we do. But within each of these frameworks, I have about 10 or 15 different projects that are in each of these areas, but I think I want to give you the big picture so that we can use that for conversation and to talk about next steps as well. One last thing in terms of setup, I know that in our meetings, we've talked about the Brendan model going national and really supporting that. And so what I'm going to talk about also are international strategies as well, and ways in which I think it certainly makes sense nationally, but also internationally. So, just a little bit about my background. As we were talking a little bit, I've been an academic for a long time. I lived in South Africa for 5 years. I've been at the University of Michigan, Syracuse University, and now American University, mostly in schools of information. So if you look at my title here, I have a joint appointment in information technology and analytics, but also in international communication and international development. And as I was telling our colleague David, that I sort of created my own space because I draw from so many different interdisciplinary perspectives in the work that I do. So I want to talk about this title. If you go back to the title, Beyond Being There for All of Us. And there's a lot that is embedded in that, in the work that I do. And we're going to talk about what beyond being there means and what it means when we talk about all of us. That's the inclusive side of this. And as I was telling Danielle during her talk, the subtitle is Understanding the Potential of Accessible Technology to Enhance Inclusive Global Governance in the Disability Community. So this is what I do. And so I never want to be seen as a technologically determined, where the technology is what I put at the forefront. I agree 100% that it's the people that are most important. But think about what we just did with David, where you had that real personal contact with David with his presentation, and he wasn't here. And that's enabled by technology, but it's not that the focus is on the technology. You want the technology to get out of the way so that you can have that personal contact. And so that's kind of the way that I think about it. So I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by global governance, because this is where, again, I spend a lot of my time given that intersection of all those different areas. What we mean by multi-stakeholder participation, what we mean by cyber infrastructure or collaboratories, or this kind of infrastructure that we were talking about, Joanne, and then how this works in the global disability community to think about how we can draw from some of these. And I'll tell you about what we've done in the learning space around these kinds of approaches. So when we first start with this idea of being there, a lot of the technology companies initially, when they were focusing on virtual technologies and so forth, really wanted to replicate what it meant to be there. And that's why they focused on high bandwidth, video conferencing, and you had to go into a special room and so forth. And there was a place for that, but this article called Beyond Being There came out in 1992, and it was saying that that was not what was most important. You want to be able to have the flexibility of being able to, see each other, yes, hear them, but to be able to share the slides and share the videos. I mean, that was a huge part of David's presentation, with the videos. And so all of that, so you want to think about, how do you go beyond being there? So think about what we just saw. His video of him was just very, very small, but it was the slides, the good quality audio, the ability to interact. If you had a whole globally distributed environment, people could talk to each other during the session, text chats, seeing the videos. All of that is sort of, it goes beyond just replicating what it means to be face-to-face, and to think about, what does a hybrid environment look like? So this was a really monumental study in the human-computer interaction, computer-supported cooperative work field. And then the National Science Foundation, which has supported a lot of these efforts, wanted to say, well, what happens when you really try to build virtual organizations and make it possible for people to work together like this? Now, again, I've been doing this for a very long time, and something has happened over the last 3 years that has accelerated a lot of this. So it used to be that we would think about some of these ideas and people would say, what are you talking about? We can't have a virtual meeting. But now, because of the pandemic, everybody realizes that, yes, you can, and it's possible to do this, but you want to get good at it. You want to be effective at having a virtual organization. But NSF has tried to help us to study, what does it mean to have an effective virtual organization? But most of these studies that have looked at using technology to enable distributed collaboration have not focused on accessibility, and have not focused on how do you do this with persons with disabilities. So we took, in 2008, some of these approaches, and we did a study on accessible cyber infrastructure. So just 2 words about cyber infrastructure that Joanne and I were just talking about. So cyber infrastructure at NSF comes out of the world of collaboratories. And collaboratory is a word that blends 2 concepts, collaboration and laboratory. And so a collaboratory is to use information technology to create a research center as if it was face-to-face, but people could be anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world. That was the idea of a collaboratory. William Wolf, who was the past president of the NSF, kind of led the effort to create this concept. And over time, the idea of a collaboratory shouldn't be this special, unique place that you have to go into, but it can be anywhere. And so it became, the idea was that it should become infrastructure. It should become cyber infrastructure. So as I was telling Joanne, when you walk into a conference, you don't get excited that there's a table there and a chair. You expect that to be there. And we were just saying, you also expect these days that there's Wi-Fi there. And then post-pandemic, now we can expect that there would be hybrid, remote participation, and so forth. So this idea of cyber infrastructure was that if scientists and engineers were using these kinds of technologies, we could all use it and become better at distributed collaboration. So we decided to do this in the national disability community. We built cyber infrastructure, and I won't go into all the details, but we looked at some resource sharing, some virtual participation. How do you identify and capture artifacts from meetings and make that available? And we did that in the national disability community. Now for us, in this audience, we understand why it's important for us to focus on disability. But I just want to highlight that this was, again, another landmark study, this World Disability Report by the World Bank and the World Health Organization. When it came out in 2011, it helped us to understand that there were more than 1 billion people in the world living with some form of disability. So far more than we thought. About 15% of every country's population is a person with a disability. So we frequently think about this as, moving away from kind of us and them. These are people with disabilities and these are people without disabilities. All of us are likely to either know somebody with a disability, have a disability ourselves, or become disabled in our lifetime. And so we want to think about, if you're supporting persons with disabilities, there's something that can support all of us. Now, internationally, private sector, NGOs, governments, have all tried to harness some of their collective activity in things like the Millennium Development Goals. So the Millennium Development Goals were a set of goals that tried to get international organizations, development organizations, private sector to work together to alleviate poverty. And it lasted for 15 years, and it did a good job of bringing people together, bringing those organizations together, but the MDGs had no focus on persons with disabilities included at all. And so we now have an opportunity where that is changing, and it's led in large part by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. So the CRPD is based on largely the US legal and policy infrastructure. The ADA, Section 508, all of the legal and policy infrastructure that we have nationally was built upon to create a global framework for disability rights. So it was made available for signature. It was finished in 2006, made available for signature in 2007. We now have 185 countries in the world that have ratified the CRPD. And it represents a shift away from what we used to call the health-based approach to disability, or the medical model, to a social justice and a rights-based model. So when Monica was talking earlier this morning about using disability and that the rights that come with that, that's both nationally and internationally. This recognized set of rights that come with from being a person with a disability. And these are human rights. So when the CRPD was adopted, it was the first human rights treaty of the 21st century, but it's also a development treaty. So it's a human rights and development instrument. And so this shift from the medical model to the social justice rights-based model was seen as helping people to understand what human rights do you have around the world. So if we look at the CRPD, it has 50 articles. In each of these articles, to me, this is one of the most comprehensive frameworks for thinking about disability rights that I've ever seen. So Article 8, and so again, most organizations tend to focus on one of these aspects of the CRPD. We've focused on the whole thing, which makes my life, see all the gray hair that I have now. So Article 8 so again, just to kind of set the context, think about those 184, 85 countries now that have agreed to this. This is a legally binding global treaty, and they've agreed to Article 8, raising awareness. So what are you doing in the country to be able to promote the rights of persons with disabilities, raise awareness about persons with disabilities, reducing the stigma of persons with disabilities? This is a critical part of the CRPD, so that awareness raising. So when we evaluate how much progress have countries made on implementing the CRPD, you can look at any of these articles and assess how well is this country doing around raising awareness around persons with disabilities. What are their strategies? What are their campaigns to reduce the stigma? And again, we talked about this a little bit earlier. If you've never been around a person that has learning differences, or never been around somebody that has autism or ADHD, or never been around somebody who's mobility impaired, it's always they're always other, somebody over there. You've never been around them, so it's different. But once you're around them all the time, it becomes normalized and is much more comfortable for us. So this idea of raising awareness is critical. Article 9 is about accessibility. So it's about physical accessibility and electronic accessibility. So everything that we do, websites, buildings, programs, have to be accessible. Article 21, freedom of expression and access to information in a way that you can understand it. And Article 24 on education, which for us was the centerpiece of our work in accessible education. So what we did was, so if you look at states parties recognize the right of persons with disabilities to education, full stop. With a view to realizing this right without discrimination on the basis of equal opportunity, states parties shall ensure an inclusive education system at all levels and lifelong learning. So that Article 24, laid the groundwork for all the work we did for 7 years in Southeast Asia. So we created the first fully online master's degree at American University. This was long before the pandemic, long before AU's other master's degrees. We created a master's in comparative and international disability policy that focused on students who were blind and visually impaired, deaf and hard of hearing, and mobility impaired, all in Southeast Asia. So we had to use these technologies before we got to Zoom, because Zoom didn't exist. Zoom has really hit the sweet spot. When it came in, it did everything right. And so we didn't have that. And so, we wrestled with a lot of this, but we created this environment that enabled persons with disabilities in Southeast Asia to become strong advocates for their rights and for the policy infrastructure that came from those countries adopting the CRPD. All of the 10 countries in ASEAN adopted the CRPD. And so we were able to create a cadre of persons with disabilities with master's degrees in public policy to be able to advocate for themselves around these issues. But I also wanted to highlight to Article 29, but Article 30. So Article 30 is about participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure, and sport. So think about these details. Again, you have a globally recognized, legally binding treaty where sport is considered one of those key elements. So enabling persons with disabilities to participate on an equal basis with others in recreation, leisure, and sporting activities, to encourage and promote the participation to the fullest extent possible for the persons with disabilities in mainstream sporting activities at all levels. So if you think about sailing, and you think about the opportunity, so what you're doing, what we're doing, what Brendan is doing is well situated within this to say, not only will we make an accessible sport and leisure program, we will try to make sure that everybody is as open as possible. That doesn't have to be the mission of the organization, but the goal is to say, nobody should be excluding persons with disabilities. None of the places where they're teaching sailing or any kind of boating activity should make our kids feel uncomfortable. They should be trained. So this to me is very much sort of square at what we're trying to do. There are also some other what I call converging opportunities for making this work for us. So there's the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So I talked earlier about the Millennium Development Goals that did not include persons with disabilities. So the 2030 is called the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you've been to New York recently or you go to some countries around the world, you'll recognize these 17 goals, which are from the SDGs. And unlike in the Millennium Development Goals, where there was no reference to persons with disabilities, in the SDGs, there are 11 explicit references, to persons with disabilities. So this international framework that, again, countries, international organizations, private sector, civil society organizations, the benefit of a framework like this is that all these organizations start to pull together in the same direction, around the same types of projects. So there are 11 references to persons with disabilities in the SDGs. There's also something called the New Urban Agenda that was adopted in Quito, which is about accessible cities. So how do you make cities as accessible as possible? And so we tried to focus on global governance was one aspect. So I wanted to highlight two of our projects for you. One was the master's program, which lasted for 5 years. We were able to educate students in Southeast Asia through that master's program. They have official American university degrees. Really, really wonderful project that I can talk about some of the details. But this is the other area that I wanted to share because we were focusing on how do you make accessible global governance. So global governance is this huge concept that means, think about what I've talked about already. All these UN treaties, all these UN strategic frameworks and reports. How does anybody in any organization in any country keep up with that, right? How do you align yourself with that? How do you influence that? It's very, very difficult. So one of the things that happens is, in theory, what would happen is you'd have to go to all of these conferences and all of these meetings all around the world, which takes time and it takes money, so it's expensive to do that. And that means that most of those voices don't get represented. So what we've tried to do is to say, can technology play a role in enabling those voices to participate? And there are some really interesting networks around disability rights issues that we've been able to tap into and support. So we used Blackboard Collaborate before Zoom. So this was one of the most accessible web conferencing tools on the market. And again, it's been blown out of the water now by Zoom. But I actually worked on the accessibility task force for Illuminate, which was the web conferencing platform that came before Blackboard. And then I worked on the accessibility task force for Blackboard as well to make sure that it was a very accessible web conferencing platform. But we wanted to compare what happens with a web conferencing tool. So like Dave was in this room giving his presentation, but we all went outside and had a bathroom break and coffee break and so forth. He couldn't join us, right? So we also put in place what are called Telepresence Robots, mobile remote presence devices. So it's kind of like an iPad on a Segway. And so those can allow a person from anywhere in the world with internet access to be able to be in the room when you're having the virtual meeting, but then go outside to the coffee shop, go to the exposition area, go up and down the escalators and so forth. So we did a study to compare what happens if you use something like this telepresence robot and you go to an international conference like this. So we tested it on campus at American. That was my son using the robot. And kids are really well adapted to this. This is like a video game to them in the real world. But then we took it to Mexico. And so we had 4 of these, and we had 4 disability hubs around the world. So we organized with organizations for persons with disabilities in Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and the US. So we had 4 remote hubs where disability groups came together physically in a room like this to control their robot in Mexico at the conference. And it was absolutely phenomenal. So we published actually a couple of studies on this, but the impact that the robots had moving around the conference was pretty amazing. And again, this is a new type of technology that can facilitate one-on-one personal interaction. So imagine you're sitting at your desk and the robot rolls up to you and starts talking. It's pretty amazing to be able to do something like this. So we did this at the conference, and it was really, really exciting to be able to do something like that. So I just wanted to share some of those ideas that really shape what I try to do in my work. And so we create studies around each of these areas, but I'd like us to think about how as what we do with Brendan, and think about expanding nationally, thinking about that sort of right to sport and leisure, and then how do you support that, and how does technology enable us to do those kinds of things? So at the end of the day, those are the ideas that I wanted to share. So what are your questions?
You could have been a spokesperson, Brendan. Exactly what we're thinking about for the Brendan version. I'm sure Charlie agrees. Having the public policy behind it is really phenomenal. It really gives us a lot of standing that we hadn't previously, or at least I had previously thought about.
Yes.
That's really great news. Thank you for that. We'll be talking to you a lot more about
yes,
that.
Yes, yes. So the downside is because I focus so much on the rest of the world, the downside is in the US, we've not ratified the CRPD. We signed it, but we haven't ratified it. And so, you say, well, what's the implication of that? Well, it means the bigger part of the implications is what happens in the rest of the world as we try to project and go and do projects in the rest of the world. In some cases, the US is excluded from it because we haven't ratified. But we do have that, again, the CRPD is based on our public policy framework for the most part. And so we do have that here in the country that's already legally binding. And there's a kind of an overlapping set of public policies and legal frameworks that we have to wrestle with in the country.
So this may be just too tactical of a question, but who are the people that sign these agreements, right? What agencies, what organizations?
Sure.
How does that make
So
sense?
it's the country. It's the country. So that the signature happens usually with the head of state. So the president or the prime minister or whoever can sign it. But then the ratification part of it, the legally binding part, comes with the ratification, where in our case, the Senate would have to ratify it. And in order to ratify it, they look at what's the legal and regulatory infrastructure that we're signing on to. Are we in line with that? And if we are, we can sign it and it's ready to be enforced at that point. And if a country doesn't have that legal framework and they sign it, they're committing themselves to put in place that kind of policy infrastructure.
And here in the United States, what is the holdup? And is it just simply they just can't get anything done?
It's politics. It's really unfortunate. So, the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, was historically a very bipartisan, non-controversial, really, piece of legislation. But over the years, as things have gotten more, our politics have gotten more contested, something that's based on the ADA and our approach now becomes politicized. So that's the gridlock really is the holdup.
So I was just going to ask, that's how I met Charlie, is I was working at the Beaufort Dock Sailing Club in Beaufort, South Carolina, pretty rural area.
Mm-hmm.
And I came in as an OT so that they found out about me because I wanted to do adaptive sailing.
Mm-hmm.
But, as the director of the program, I was tasked with a million other organizational challenges first. But one of the things that was such a struggle was to convince people that we should have an adaptive sailing program. Because the board members and the people that I was interacting with, they're all good people, but they're like, well, what about insurance, or what about this or that? And I love what you said, because I'm like, okay, so, why do we even have a separate adaptive program? Because this should be that the program has adaptation built into it. So you have the ability to sail no matter who you are. You have to do a 24 keel load. If you have a physical disability, you have an instructor maybe who can help you do one-on-one learning stuff, different approaches, that all the instructors get trained in a different approach. So, I'm just integrating my life experience with what you're saying, and it's frustrating because I could have, if I had known about this, I could have said, well, look, this is the international standard that we are upheld in, that we are holding to this. We don't have to argue about it.
Right.
So really, it's really advanced. This is pretty amazing, and we are still struggling with this in the United States.
So to use a key word that I wrote here, ISO, are there any standards that are governing this?
So as we start to think about individual domains, so let's say sailing, there's not a body of knowledge for what makes accessible sailing that I know of. That's certainly something that the organization could help to promote as well. A kind of a sister organization in my mind to Brendan is CRAB in Annapolis. But so whereas Brendan focuses on students with learning differences, CRAB focuses on physical disabilities. But it's one could work to create this body of knowledge of what makes accessible sailing, an accessible sailing program. There are already accessible skiing programs and diving programs and so forth. So we could have kind of a code of conduct almost, or kind of a best practices for what it means to be adaptive sailing.
So maybe you could take a look at Charlie's top right now, because she's wearing the National On-Water Standards top, because we created American National Standards for sailing, paddlecraft, and also for power boating, consensus-based standard, American National Standard, and an instructional standard. The concept was that we would have endorsements down the road. And
Exactly.
Accessible would be one of them.
Exactly.
So it took us 11 years to do those 4 standards. What that's like. We finished that a couple of years ago, so maybe that's the next round.
Absolutely could be. And I'm just thinking too about, Danielle, what you're saying, and I'm thinking about, and Charlie, your presentation, which we talked about, thinking about how to expand the Brendan approach without having the Brendan network and infrastructure and donors. And it goes back to perhaps you've got these places that have the infrastructure, they have the boats, they have the instructors, they just don't have the training or the commitment or whatever. So, maybe we don't have to replicate everything that Brendan has, but you help to get them ready to be able to accept and support students with learning differences as they come into the program.
Well, I'm thinking that the leaders of the centers are the ones that are going to these meetings, especially social impact nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
Leaders of nonprofits get burned out.
Yes.
And it's a big problem because they have the biggest impact on the world. Nonprofits really impact communities. So educating the leader on why. So you can go to the board and you can say, this is why we're doing this, because people act when they know why. But if you say, let's just do an adaptive sailing program for kids on the spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't explain why.
Right.
Then people sometimes say, they get, the fear gets in the way. So the education piece, I think, is what's really.
And I'm sure Beth would agree with you, because that's Beth's bailiwick, right?
Yeah, well, and this today, and this in particular, as we talk about, because we're about to launch the marketing, and now we've got the Brendan approach and everything. So it's just, because before it's like, okay, we're going to focus on community sailing centers and whatever. They're like, our programs are full.
Right.
We don't need this.
That's right.
It's just like, but really, you have to go back to 20% of Americans have
Yes.
a learning difference.
That's right.
So how do we, how do we expand this beyond that? So, and it is truly within the communities and stuff to create this. And then, the other interesting thing too is like, there's not a lot of this is, Derrick, is based on physical disabilities, like the adaptive skiing, and the diving and everything. It's not anything, it's not focused on the learning disabilities,
Right.
and or the learning differences.
Right. Which is why I think this is so exciting.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
And
very
so just two or three quick things. So one, Danielle, so part of the challenge is people, if they think they have to do it all on it, they might be well-meaning, but if they think they have to do all this on their own and they don't know where to start and so forth, they say, put that aside and I'll go on to the things that I know how to do. So having this Brendan approach to say there is a way to do this. We know how to do it. We've been doing it. You could adopt this however the organization wants to, get that to them. So that's one. So the other thing is, when I talk about moving from the the medical model to the social justice and rights-based model, and that goes back to what Monica was saying earlier. So those programs that are saying, "Oh, we're fine," we've got enough people and so forth. Pretty soon they're going to get sued. They're going to get sued because I have a right to education. I have a right to employment. I have a right to recreation and leisure and sport. And so if when that starts to confront them, and I don't want to think about it just like that, but if you don't want to do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do, at some point, just like universities, absolutely, universities took a long time to say, well, we're going to make captioning available in our thing. They didn't want to do it. It took too much time. Universities got sued, left and right. And so then they had to open up and be more inclusive for supporting the rights of students with disabilities. If somebody's otherwise qualified, they have a right to go to the university if they can get admitted. So it goes back to that point, Beth, is those who don't want to do it because they say that they're full and so forth, at some point, they're going to run into that. And so we could help them to say, you can get out ahead of this and start being better prepared for taking on students. And it goes back to something else we were talking about at lunch. If you take the universal design for learning approach, so one of the other things that has come out of this, so universal design is an architecture concept. We talked a little bit about this at lunch, where you design a building that, let me go back to the key one that everybody talks about, are curb cuts. So if you're walking down the sidewalk, you come to a corner, and you go down the curb cut, the little ramp, and then up the other side. Well, that's an accessibility feature, but everybody benefits from it. If you're dragging a bag or pushing a baby stroller or in your rollerblades, that's everybody benefits from that. So universal design has been applied to learning, and it's called Universal Design for Learning Principles. And one of the core components, and I think David might have talked about this, it's sort of multiple means of learning. So whenever you teach something, you shouldn't just teach it one way. So, he talked about tactile, auditory, and so forth. Absolutely. And so if you adopt this universal design for learning approach, you don't have to have people over there in a special class. You can have them in this class. And if you teach it multiple ways, it benefits those people who need to learn this way, and those people who need to learn this way, and those people who need to learn this way.
And that's the beauty of the Brennan approach,
Mhm.
because it does touch so many
Yep.
people.
And-
And it doesn't necessarily apply to individuals who are mainstream, quote unquote, and don't have,
Yep.
because it is helpful all the way around.
Yeah, and that was immediately clear to me when I saw that manipulables. I was like, oh my gosh, how good that would be, as opposed to the way most people do it.
Yeah.
I see multiple questions, comments, and Dave.
A perfect example of that is Radcliffe Preschool in Chestertown.
Mhm.
I don't know if you've heard of it, but they use everything. They use tactile, kinesthetic. My daughter went there, and now she's in high school. Why went to upper school, but she went to Radcliffe, and they use everything. The kids are on the floor with different modalities, and the kids that go to Radcliffe are kids with learning disabilities, but there are other kids that go there too, just to have that kind of learning experience. They're usually kids of faculty and head of school, but they do great. They still go there and they learn what they need to learn, and then there are levels, and they kind of adapt it based on where the kid is, but they're all experiencing this multi-sensory experience.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so-
Dave, I see your hand up.
Yeah. So, number one, Derrick, it was really interesting to hear the work that you're doing with your colleagues. I have to say it's pretty impressive. More than pretty, it's impressive. And I'm thinking, about this whole notion of global governance and accessibility, and then I'm trying to link it back to Brendan. And as I was listening to Charlie, for example, I've got, this is how old I am. I've got sticky notes that are stuck to my desk, a bunch of them. But I was just, and I did this with, I told Danny that I did the same thing with her presentation, but I was pulling out the nuggets, right? What are the things that they're doing? And then in my head, I'm thinking, okay, I'm connecting these now to what I understand from both practice, but also from the research base, right? And then I started thinking, okay, this notion of having access globally through technology, now we have, like you said, it's opened our eyes that we don't have to necessarily always be face to face personally in the same space. So, then I started thinking, the notion of badging, right? Where, Brendan and Charlie, I don't know what y'all have that's tangible in terms of a quote curriculum or a set of standards, but I could see how Brendan could really begin to identify what are the core principles and the core actions that we take from both a accessibility standpoint, but also from a learning standpoint, and that becoming something that then professional development could be delivered, right? And have some type of badging system in place where folks could earn a standards-based badge for participating and demonstrating skills related to what Brendan is doing. And I think, one of the cool things about that we've been talking about with respect to kind of this burgeoning beginning research that we're doing with them on social emotional outcomes is beginning to really dig in and say, okay, this is what you're doing, man, this is all really good stuff. And it connects very directly to the research base on teaching and learning for students with learning differences. And then that becomes a mechanism for thinking, okay, well, how do you now take this curriculum and make it accessible again to folks, whether it's across the country or internationally. And so anyway, I would not have thought about that if you had not presented today about how that kind of thing could happen, because obviously and now I'm thinking, okay, Derrick, how connected are you to NSF, and how do we leverage this into some type of proposal? Because I don't know if you're familiar with the Convergence Accelerator competition. They've got a track H now, which is the disability for the first time. And so some colleagues of mine have put in a proposal, but I was just, I'm thinking, oh crap, well, it's at least on the radar now, right?
Absolutely. Well, but when I'm not on sabbatical, I do about 3 panel reviews for NSF a year.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to look at the numbers. I've been relatively successful as a PI and co-PI on NSF proposals, so we definitely can talk about that, David.
Well, that'd get Brendan on the map.
Absolutely. And just to build on what you're saying, David, so I could see 2 approaches. So starting with what you've already presented, saying this is the kind of curriculum, this is the core, these are the standards, this is what we would like to see, in a learning differences accessible sailing program. This is what it would look like. So then it's either assessing this particular place and saying, do you meet these standards? If you happen to, you could get the badge or the
credential.
If you don't meet it, you could take our training, and then once you meet it, you get it. And then, you could have, so there's a way to sort of promulgate that. So developing the standards, assessing, and then promulgating that approach could work really, really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Danny, by the way, you might even want to think about this badging notion for your own company, because you might be able to develop your own PD for people who want to become coaches like you, just to say.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because before I decided to work on my business and then focus on sailing, I was a little all over the place. And so one of my core shifts, focused on 1 to 2 employment opportunities, kind of came from my own experience, because I was like, okay, I've got this business idea, but I'm not committed to doing it full time. And so anyways, and I was doing some different nonprofit consulting jobs. And I was working on a contract for this guy out in the Bay Area. And he started multiple, so it's called multiplehub.org. And I think he's going to want to connect with you, but essentially he wanted to create a digital, accessible global accelerator for a community that accelerates technology development for autism. So his first event, the inaugural event, he had, there's a couple, the disability, disability fund. We had people from some different venture capitalists who invest in EdTech and disability technology, and we had like over 200 people show up on a virtual platform, a virtual conference platform. And then he had lead founders of companies in autism technology speak and pitch their companies virtually. And then the venture capitalists from these different funds that are DEI inclusive were there to give them feedback. And it was really cool. And so he's now, continuing forward. And I left doing that to pursue this, but I'm just thinking, because what you're saying, you almost would want to, I would want to connect you to him, because what you're saying about this globally speaking, that we've got these standards, I mean, that's really something that we've got to get out there to the layperson's understanding, because I think that that's, from my experience, what I've seen is it's like, okay, I went to school in Boston and everybody's hot topic knows about this, and then you move to a rural area and, well, how are they enacting these things? And it's not happening, because the United States is still very state-based.
Right.
So it's not like going to Germany, right, where everything is standard and beautiful across the country. It's like, that's not the way it is here, so, yeah.
The concept of standards is always very exciting since I was the administrator of the building, the standards for voting and instruction and voting through the Coast Guard, that's the Coast Guard grant.
Right.
That, talk about that. But, you know, David, to your point, the Brendan Approach program that we are developing now and going to launch in August, it does pretty much what you said in terms of providing an opportunity for folks to have training, and as a result of that training, they will receive a certificate. They will be in a database. We will track them, and hopefully they'll come back in 2-3 years, depending upon what we decide is the longevity of the certification, and get refresher course or upgrades and that sort of thing. Then the next logical movement is to create a standard where we move to actually identifying the best practices and standardize that across the country. I don't know what your experience has been, but according to the American National Standards Institute, if you look at ABYC, American Yacht Council, which is an enhancing program, it costs about $1 million, $1.5 million to generate one standard, one consensus-based standard across the country. So Brendan right now is not in a position to create an American national standard, but it is consensus-based.
Right.
So we would, naturally have to gather and collect and create buy-in from anybody materially affected by the standard of the country, right, by the outcome of the country. So it's a big endeavor, but we're up for the task, and we're going to start with our Brendan approach and hopefully train folks across the country to integrate this approach in their sailing programs. So that's what we're step.
I didn't know it would cost that much money.
American National Standard, you must have everybody materially affected involved in the process.
Wow.
And it must be consensus-based.
Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Now, is that separate, Joanne, from a voluntary standard?
It is a voluntary.
So that still would be a voluntary
It's still a
standard?
voluntary standard.
Okay.
But for American National Standard Institute to approve it,
Okay. It has,
there's a lot of rules.
Okay.
And that's why it's so expensive. And it takes time. Buying takes time, right? We did ours. We took about 2 years to do the first one in Power because we were just starting, and we went even above and beyond what the normal process was. We actually validated standards in the field, on the water, at 26 sites across the country with real people and real boats, with evaluators looking and 3 points of contact, and it was really scientifically done, following all research protocols. So even with that, we accelerated, and in 11 years we did 4 standards. But we have a lot of volunteers. Charlie was a volunteer on the evaluator team as well, and hosted one of our validation programs. So we are setting our sights on, but we're going to talk about it first.
okay, that sounds good. So, but back to what David was saying, so if somebody does adopt the Brendan approach, gets trained, gets their certificate, what does that allow them to do? Will they be able to say something on the website or in their advertising that?
Well, that's our hope, absolutely, that they'll be able to say our instructors have this certification, have a Brendan approach certification.
Okay.
So that's the hope, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and 2 of the things that we really need in order to effectively market this is what's in it for me, why do these people want to do this, and then in the end, what do they get?
Right.
So I think those are 2 things that as we continue to develop our message, that the messaging is really important.
And their experience will be that they're serving their population, their audience, their.
Yes.
That already exists, that already exists. We know that they exist, whether or not they know that they exist yet.
Exactly.
It's amazing how many parents that you talk to that, like, the first thing that they'll say is, my kid went to this sailing camp and they didn't like it. And
Right.
now we're trying this because
Yeah,
they,
right.
you know, or they went to whatever, whether it was, you know, horseback riding camp or whatever,
Right.
and they didn't fit in, or they didn't like it, or whatever. So this is, so I think, I mean, that's really how, that's part of the message is so we can, you know, we can create whatever that word, inclusivity, I can't say the word, yeah. So,
Well, I was just gonna say too, I think what you guys, what you're doing is really special from a young adult perspective, is when I did the Brennan approach with the sailing instructors in Beaufort, I'm thinking, okay, they're 18, 19, they already beat me for having to come in 2 days early on their summer break to do this training. And so I was nervous about it, but it's really creating empathy.
It's so important.
It's so important,
Like-
and then it's creating just a better culture. And they did tell me, the instructors did tell me that they really liked the takeaways on how to teach, because
Yes.
then when it rains outside, or they're bored, or it's New England camp and they're tired, or beaten down by the sun. Well, what are my where's my toolkit? And it's
Right.
the same thing for teachers when teachers get burned out. And then they're like, well, what can I do? And then if you just turn open the Brennan approach, you see, okay, Brennan's given me like all these different alternative ways of teaching. And that was what the feedback I got. The instructors were like, that was the coolest part.
I have to say that this is such a great idea, because the whole reason, my daughter loved horseback riding. She rode, she was natural at it, and the minute that they upped it to her tacking up the horse, she couldn't follow, she couldn't remember, she couldn't understand how to take the horse out and tack up the horse. And she tried, and they weren't patient with her, and she quit the whole thing, and she's never gone back to it since. So it's like, it just makes me think that if somebody had some sort of approach like that for her needs, that she would still be riding now.
That's
and
right.
Be free. Once free, like she's so sometimes so anxious, anxiety just takes over her life. And if she had that thing that she loved without having to tack up the horse, and I went from stable to stable, could she just ride without tacking up the horse? No, well, we have them tack up the horse when they get this age. All right, but so we're just gonna have to not do it, I guess,
And it goes back to, I think, what Danielle was just saying too. If I'm interpreting what you're saying, part of that could be creating these advocates or supporters at every place where we do the training. Now you've got 2 or 3, maybe not all 10 of the staff, but maybe 2 or 3 people at that particular facility who's going to be more empathetic, who's going to be more aware of tools and have a toolbox they can draw from, and so forth. And it goes back to David's video of Joshua, I think was his name, the young lady behind the cash register. And I couldn't quite tell what they were trying to say, but for me, when I was watching it, she played a pivotal role in his transformation. She sort of supported him, and he had somebody that was supporting him, and then he went outside and started dancing. So if you have just that one person who at the stable, if there was one person that might be
right, and I
who would
tried
say-
to be that person
Right.
by videotaping everything,
Right.
and we're playing it back to her.
Right.
But
So imagine you had somebody in the stable who could say to the rest of them, why not? Why can't we be different? Why can't we do this slightly differently to enable this person who wants to do this? So
exactly. So
anyway.
thank you.
All right, thank you everybody, and thank you.